Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies. In this episode, we're going to cover my experiment to paint horses in a quick and easy way that still looks great using speed paints.
Miniature Landscape Hobbies is proudly supported by these sponsors.
In my 30 years as a miniature painter, I've learned that there are two types of painters out there: the kind that like to paint horses and the kind that don't. When it comes to me, I've got to level with you. I actually don't really like painting horses at all. This is because after I'm done painting the riders with a lot of care, painting their mounts just doesn't seem like it's a great priority. The other thing, of course, is that I come from a model painting background that's all about armor. Tanks and other vehicles generally have hard edges that reflect the light, so this makes the process of highlighting very distinctive. Horses are a little different because, of course, they're completely organic, so they generally have a lot of rounded shapes that don't create hard edges to reflect light. This creates a real problem with building contrast on horses. Rather than being able to highlight a hard edge with a nice bright color, you really can't do that. Instead, you have to build differences between the musculature in order to give the horse some depth for the viewer. This is generally, I find anyways, pretty tough. Fortunately for us, we have a new option: speed paints. This cool product is really great, and it's changing the way people paint miniatures. If you've been living under a rock in the miniature gaming community recently, maybe you don't know about speed paints. These are an awesome type of product that you can lay down over zenithal underpainting in order to establish all kinds of contrast. With this in mind, then, it seems that speed paints would be the perfect thing to paint horses. However, I don't have a lot of experience with it. So in this video, I'm going to take you through my method and run an experiment as to what colors look the best. Let's get to it.
I'd like to take a quick moment to thank my Patreon supporters. Without their assistance, Miniature Landscape Hobbies would not be possible. If you would like to learn more about the benefits of becoming a Patreon supporter, please check the link in the video description. To start with this experiment, I decided to go with a gray primer. Why gray? Well, horses have more subtle depth because they're basically slabs of rounded muscle. They don't have panels, crevices, or sharp angles to create deep shadow, so black was out. When it comes to white, I feel that if you prime with it and use speed paints over top, you miss some depth. So gray won out as the initial primer. After applying it, it was time to pick out some Army Painter speed paints, which would make for decent horse coloration. Of course, if you're using Citadel Contrast, Color Express, or any other zenithal type of paint, the process would be the same. After studying some pictures of horses, I landed on Brownish Decay, Dark Wood, Gravelord Gray, Warrior Skin, Pallid Bone, and Holy White as my colors. I thought this would give me a pretty convincing, yet varied palette. Next comes the consideration for speed. Using speed paints is, well, speedier than, say, acrylic layering, but any painter knows that organizing the process into batches really helps. So, since my objective was to do 12 horses, I divided this into 3 groups. One group had 6 horses, and I also had 2 batches of 3 horses. The colors I picked meant that I'd have 2 horses of each color to make the 12 total. Considerations for the layers themselves came next. Speed paints rely on base layers to establish shading. Generally, this is done right over a white primer or by using the so-called slap chop method. Slap Chop, though, comes out a little dark in general, and, again, horses are closer to a muscly blob than a Sherman tank, so I decided to start with a different approach. To this end, I decided that it would be best to use the color underpainting method. This is where you use lighter colors that are similar to your chosen speed paints as the base layers. This has two advantages. First, it creates a deeper, richer gradient of shades on the final product. And, more importantly, it allows you to thin your speed paints, which would be a major consideration for these models. I think speed paint thinner is really a key piece of the puzzle to maximizing the use of these paints. One of the major complaints I see with speed paints is that they pool unpredictably on large surfaces. Finely textured areas are no issue, but the broad rounded flanks of a horse should be a real issue for speed paints. Except the solution to this is really quite straightforward. Mix about 25% thinner to 75% paint, and you're good. With all this covered, now it's time to look at the actual process. Grabbing the gray painted horses, I break them into batches, as I mentioned, and start the underpainting. The first batch I spray with a 50-50 mix of NATO brown and aged white to start. Then I layer straight aged white over top of this, focusing on the upper surfaces that would be in direct light or on the larger muscle groups. When this was dry, I decided to push the contrast further with a dry brush of ivory to pick out all the extreme edges and highlighted points on the model. The next batch was much the same, but I wanted a darker base layer, so I went with straight NATO brown to start. Over this, I went with a layer of 50-50 NATO brown and ivory white, and a final dry brush of deck tan. The last batch would be made up of 2 gray horses and 1 white one. Underpainting these started with a 50-50 dark gray and white mix, then a light gray, and finally a white dry brush. Before we move on from this step, I must say that yes, I used an airbrush. If you don't have one, you could acrylic layer paint this step, or more likely, you might just want to rely on heavy dry brushing. But that being said, this step would take me only 10 to 15 minutes for each batch with an airbrush, and this does in fact include drying times. So if you're at all serious about painting large numbers of models quickly, I do recommend at some point you bite the bullet and get an airbrush. Anyway, when the underpainting had set for each horse, it was time to move on to the speed paint application. Starting with the batch of 6, which was done with the NATO brown and aged white, I applied dark wood, wire skin, and pallid bone. For this batch, I thinned the paint as mentioned, but I decided to use an airbrush to apply the speed paints and see how it worked. Everything went on fine and extremely smoothly, although in hindsight, the airbrush reduced the degrees of pooling in the deeper musculature. Next time I do this process, I'll definitely just thin the paint and brush it on like normal. That way I could preserve the way the paint gathers to build some more shading. Moving on to the NATO brown and sand underpainted horses, these were given a coat of thinned down brownish decay. I applied this by brush and got that nice deeper shading that I lacked on the airbrush speed paints. With the white and gray horse batch, I used Gravelord Gray first on, you guessed it, the gray horses. And then I went on to use Holy White on the white horse. Now, I love speed paints, but not Holy White. My experience with the V1 version of this paint was infuriating, and really when I prepared this model, I expected the worst. Except this doubt was completely unjustified. The V2 Holy White applied like a dream, and when it was dry, it might have been the best looking of all the paints I've used so far. The manes, tails, and hooves of the horses were all super easy. Just switch up your color choices between the different horses. For instance, with my white horse, I used pallid bone on the tail and mane. Occasionally, I used grim black as well. At this point, I was as always marveling at how powerful speed paints are. But here I need to make an observation. I find they're good for providing an equivalent of a base color and what would usually be considered 2 to 3 midtone layers. Naturally, this is awesome, and it really does save a lot of time. But, do speed paints really provide a nice sharp highlight? Sort of. If speed paints are thinned correctly, and you're using certain colors, pallid bone being my favorite, you might not need a final highlight. But more often than not, you'll need an old-fashioned brushed-on highlight to build the final level of contrast. Fortunately, to do this with highlights, it's really easy. Take your dry brush highlight that you've already done on the horse, so in this case either ivory, deck tan, or white, and mix it 50-50 with the respective speed paint you just applied. So for instance, for the warrior skin coloration horses, I did the dry brush with ivory. So I mixed 50-50 regular ivory acrylics with warrior skin to get the highlight color. Next I grabbed a 000 brush and traced any of the prominent musculature and the bridge of the nose, over the eyes, etc. to pump up the contrast. If you want, it's now time to paint the markings. I never get too elaborate with this. All I typically do is get out some white paint and stipple it into patches around hooves, on the noses, etc. Since the final focus will likely be on the rider, not for the mount, my philosophy here is less is more. At this point, most of the work is done. I go on and do the reins, saddles, saddle cloths, etc. This will of course vary a ton by the subject, and it has all the same considerations as any other model, so I won't get into specifics here. If your objective is purely speed, you can now do the basing, do a varnish layer, and you're done. However, I always find it's a good idea to set up a bit more contrast by lining in. To do this, I apply a couple of quick coats of satin varnish to all of the horses. I use an airbrush, but you could use a rattle can just as easily. When the varnish is dry, I pour out some mineral spirits and dampen a brush with it. With the brush, I then brush the thinner onto each horse very lightly. At this point, I get out dark brown and black enamel panel liners, although you could also use thin oil paints if you wanted. Then I take this mix and run it into the crevices and shadowed areas on each model. The addition of the thinner breaks the surface tension on the enamels and draws them into the deeper areas that require shading, and this helps save on time. For the brown horses, I used, brown panel liner, and for the white ones and the gray ones, I used black. This completes the process for the horses. From here, you can add your basing and apply a final matte varnish layer. So there you have it, my little experiment and method for speed painting horses. How did it work? Well, honestly, I think it worked very well. All the parts came together to make a very pleasing result. Two things did come up though, and I feel these would require some revisions in the future. First, using the airbrush to apply the layer of speed paints resulted in less depth from the way the paints pool to build shade. So in the future, I'll just use a brush for this. Second, I could stand to have more variation in colors. Next time I'll get more adventurous with a variety of different paints. That being said, I'd probably skip the step with warrior skin. Honestly, the warrior skin coloration horses look a little too pinkish. It was worth a try, but I think that in the end, these horses look more like they're made out of bologna as opposed to being made out of horse. As always, this process and my color choices were of my own design. Growing as an artist is all about sharing. So if you have any ideas about colors or techniques that make your horse miniatures look great, please include them in the comments below. If you'd like to know more about painting Napoleonic models, please watch this video. Or if you're curious about painting skin tones, consider watching this video instead. Thanks for watching, and as always, remember to keep building life in miniature.